The trip back to the mainland was uneventful. With just the two of them in the boat, Tyler and Walter made good time. And after retracing their steps, they found the truck. It was still hidden at the abandoned ranger station. Despite a few technical difficulties, Tyler got the vehicle back on the road.
So where is this stash of yours?
Tyler asked as he navigated back up the main highway. He didn't so much as deviate from the overgrown path. Instead, he followed in the exact tracks they'd made only a day before. Walter held the handle above the door as if his life depended on it. Tyler was driving a lot faster than he'd ever dare on such terrain. He was going even faster than he had the night before.
It's just outside Velocity,
he directed.
There's a little suburb to the south.
Tyler nodded.
I think I know the place.
2 hours passed in silence as they traveled back down to the lowlands. Their only deviation was to get more gas. With the late hour, there wasn't much traffic, not even when they reached the city limits. Thankful for the small respite, Tyler followed his companion's directions. This part of the city had changed a bit since he'd last come down. Either that or he was just tired.
Over there,
Walter called out as he pointed to a sagging sign. The board advertised a rather run-down-looking storage facility. It boasted low rent and great security. Weeds filled the spaces between concrete driveway and chain-link fencing. It gave it an almost abandoned feel, but there was a coated gate in fairly new condition at the entrance. Once inside the complex, Walter directed Tyler down several rows of units. Each aisle looked more derelict than the one before.
You sure this is the right place?
The dragon asked. Despite the new gate, the rest of the area looked run down. It looked like a jungle trying to reclaim its surroundings. The smile the veteran gave him was a little disconcerting, but it more than conveyed the affirmative answer he gave in response to the question.
You know, despite its outward condition, this place is actually pretty secure. Besides, there's a rumor the place is haunted. Most people stay away, and those dumb enough to try and trespass pay the consequences. Guess you can say it's part of the charm.
With a few more directions, Tyler pulled the truck to a stop outside a long line of units. Each stall had an upward sliding metal door with a slide bolt and lock, but upon further inspection, it became obvious that this was, for the most part, just for show. Off to one side of each unit was a small box that blended in with the stucco siding. Each box contained a key-coded entry pad. Making a bit of a show of it, Walter opened the box and entered his code. A few clicks announced the system's deactivation. Sure the process was complete, he pulled out a normal key and undid the lock before sliding the bolt. Tyler let out a low whistle as Walter opened the sliding door.
That's quite the collection,
he said in admiration.
Saving up for a special occasion?
Walter walked into the storage space. Once inside, he began moving around various boxes of explosives and ammunition.
Nah,
he replied.
Well, you know me. I just like to be prepared. That, and if a zombie apocalypse happens, I want to be ready. I've got another unit a door or two down, packed with survival rations.
Shaking his head, Tyler went to help his friend.
You wouldn't happen to have a boat in here, would you?
Shelves lined the walls. Some created a sort of labyrinth in the space that was large enough to house a mid-sized motorboat, or maybe a small dragon. Walter laughed as he moved a canister of grenades to the front.
Nah, that's in my other locker.
His grin widened with Tyler's expression.
You know I'm kidding. I do have an inflatable raft, though.
Tyler shook his head again.
We'd better get this stuff in the truck. Anything else you'd want to bring back? Keep in mind, we can't take everything with us. No kitchen sinks this go-around.
Looking around, Walter spotted a box of small gray cans. Grabbing it, he navigated back to the front of the locker. After pulling out a folded mass of rubber, he locked the storage space.
Yep, that should do,
he confirmed as he carried his load to the truck.
All those boxes and cans right there.
Tyler cited the amount of equipment but helped move it into the back of the truck. He just hoped Walter's raft was up to the challenge of shuttling it all across the water in one trip. Picking up the last box, he pushed it over the hanging tailgate. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him and he swayed ever so slightly. Walter pushed the box further in and closed the tailgate. He wiped sweat from his brow.
Ooh, good thing that raft's military grade, ain't it? Now we just have to figure a way to drag all this stuff to the shore.
Tyler closed his eyes as he leaned against the auto's metal body. Something was definitely not right. He never felt this way. Not unless he was at his strength's end. And he knew that wasn't possible. He had had more than ample time to recover while back at Walter's house.
Hey,
Walter said, clapping him on the back.
You're not falling asleep on me, are you? Ready to go?
He paused, noting his friend's unusual behavior.
Oh, you okay? You want me to drive?
Tyler shook his head.
It's nothing. Chances are good it's just a side effect from wearing myself out.
He shrugged away the man's hand and took his place behind the steering wheel. Walter followed him around the vehicle and then continued to the passenger side. It was possible Tyler was only suffering a bit of relapse, or a side effect, as he put it. He'd never seen the dragon so worn down before, but he doubted that was the problem. With that in mind, he decided to keep a closer eye on his friend. Starting the engine, Tyler put the vehicle into gear and headed down the road. He mentally pushed past the dizziness to focus on driving, but keeping his current condition in mind, he decided to take a different, much closer route to the lake. Without Anwen with them, it was less likely the Mage Circle would notice two men in a boat. Daphne all but laughed at the look on Anwen's face. It was such a nice expression, a mix of physical anguish and absolute shock. It made her announcement more than worth it.
You didn't know? Oh, that's right. You're just a wannabe mage.
She flicked that imaginary nail polish on her nails.
And what does a wannabe know? Nothing. So how could you know about my position in the mage circle? Not even Courtney knows.
She scoffed. Anwen could only stare with unseeing eyes. Her face felt frozen with the realization of what Daphne had just told her. She couldn't be that powerful. It couldn't be true. Her soul cried out from the frozen flesh. She silently screamed as the scars flared like burning brands. What Daphne was suggesting wasn't possible. She was just a teenager, albeit a rather ambitious and malicious one, but there was no way she could be that high up in the circle. Then again, what did Anwen know about it? She barely had any knowledge of dragon mages, let alone the different factions. Everything she knew about them she'd learned from Courtney and Tyler. Daphne flounced off her imaginary stool.
Oh, it's true. I was part of the inner circle, the higher-ups, if you will, right up there with Madam Millard. We were probably on equal footing, honestly, until you killed him. But it doesn't really matter. It is what it is.
An image of the overweight innkeeper flashed in Anwen's mind. There had always been something creepy about that woman. Now she knew why. Tyler parked the truck at a different ranger station. This one looked even more run down than the other, but more importantly it was further ahead than the previous one, and closer to the water's edge. It meant less of a walk to the shore, something he felt would be better for the both of them. Walter began unloading the boxes from the truck's bed, carrying them the 50 or so yards to the lake. After a few boxes, they worked out a system. One man brought a container half the distance while the other took it the rest of the way. Tyler stayed at the top while Walter took the bottom half of the trail. Between loads, Tyler leaned against the truck. With his eyes closed, he tried to regain some semblance of normalcy. Despite his attempts to shunt it inside, the dizziness had not left him. And now it was getting worse. It became so bad that he stumbled with the last load, his vision blurring enough to make him see double. Walter came back in time to relieve him of the bundle of rubber he'd been carrying. Seeing the strain on his face, he made Tyler sit down with his head between his knees.
Whoa. No good if you can't see straight.
He warned as he looked his friend in the eyes. With a sigh, Tyler nodded. He watched the veteran carry the rubber raft down to the water's edge from his log perch. The process was quickly carried out and Tyler moved to go help the man inflate the raft. Halfway there, pain shot through his arms and legs as though they'd been pierced with a searing flame. He let out a strangled cry as he crumpled to the ground, his breath coming in short spurts. As he lay there, the searing sensation spread throughout his extremities. The experience made him unable to move. It was worse than anything he'd ever felt. Before any further sounds of anguish could escape his lips, he clamped his mouth shut. He knew any further sounds he made would be anything but quiet. Hearing the initial outcry, Walter turned to check on his friend. He half expected to see the dragon sitting where he'd left him, maybe throwing up, but he was surprised to see him on the ground. Quickly making sure the raft was secure, he ran to his friend's side. Tyler had closed his eyes. The sight of the tree branches waving overhead made him nauseous. He continued to clench his teeth to keep from screaming. The sound would carry on at least to the far side of the lake if he didn't. Sweat beaded up on his skin with the effort to remain silent.
Not good.
Walter groaned as he knelt by the dragon's side. Tyler's face was pale, more so than he'd ever seen him. And yet, when Walter touched his skin, it burned as though from a high fever.
You don't look so good.
He said, trying to lighten the situation. The dragon arched his back, pushing up from the ground. His teeth ground together as scales formed up and down his arms and legs. Steam began to rise from his neck and chest. A low growl filled the air as he fought against the acid coursing through his senses. Not sure what was going on or what would help, Walter did the first thing that came to mind. He ran back to the lake and emptied one of the ammunition cans, then filled it with water. Hurrying back as fast as he could, he dumped the liquid over Tyler's head. Tyler gasped again as the water hit his body. His jaws separated top from bottom. Some of the liquid spilled into his mouth as he opened it. His eyes flew open.
Callum!
He called out, not sure if his brother would hear him or if his spirit would even come. For some reason, he felt it more likely his brother would answer his call than that Kern would. And since the near him was likely meditating, he thought it the more likely Callum would help him. The sensation he felt reminded him of touching the knife Daphne had thrown on the mountain, only this was much stronger in nature.
Greetings, my brother. I believe your thoughts may be correct,
Callum said as he materialized in front of the Dragon Lord.
It is good the poison does not flow in your veins.
His human form was still translucent, tinged slightly with moonlight. It made him look more like a ghost than something tangible.
You were wise to call me.
Tyler tried to sit up, but couldn't as another wave of acid seemed to rain across his body.
What's happening to me?
He asked through teeth, trying to elongate in his mouth. Callum's phantom form wavered momentarily as he stood in thought.
It is as you thought. The pain you are feeling is that of poisoning from revenant blood.
He finally confirmed.
And yet, none has entered your body. Most curious. I have never seen anything like this before. I wish I could be more helpful, but this is beyond my knowledge.
Walter watched helplessly. He wasn't sure what was going on or who Tyler was talking to, but he hoped it wasn't a sign that things were worse than he'd observed. Tyler wasn't the hallucinating type. He contemplated going back to the shore for more water, just in case. Tyler's eyes went wide as an image flashed through his mind. He was back in the mountain, searching desperately for Anwen. She was clawing chunks of fallen rubble away from her fragile form. He was holding her lifeless body in his arms. Then he was bending over her, his hand pressed against her chest as he forced a part of his soul into her body, calling her soul back from death.
Anwen!
She almost choked. Callum's eyes widened upon hearing him speak her name. He could hear the thoughts running through his brother's mind.
You didn't you?
He accused with a hiss.
You gave her a part of your soul. You know that practice is strictly forbidden.
He seemed to gather himself together, like something trying to become as small as possible.
Giving your soul to a mortal.
He said the last word as though it were an epithet.
How could you?
Tyler closed his eyes, the image of Anwen's pale, dead face floating behind his eyelids. It was more painful than the revenant poison's sensation.
She was dying!
He gasped.
Better you had let her die.
Callum responded, pulling further away.
This is a curse you have brought upon yourself, brother. What she feels, you will now feel. What you feel, she may even feel. And if one of you dies, the other dies. Did you never wonder why such an act was forbidden?
The pupils in Tyler's eyes narrowed to pinpricks as Callum's words sank in.
What she feels, you will now feel. If one of you dies, the other dies.
The words echoed over and over again as his body became even more rigid.
Did you never wonder why such an act was forbidden?
Seeing the realization sink in, Callum closed his eyes in pity. It was foolishness to fall in love with a mortal. It had been similar foolishness that had presented the rather unfortunate consequences in the first place, and that foolishness had ended in tragedy when that mortal had died. It was why one dragon sharing his or her soul with a mortal was considered one of the highest of taboos.
She will not live forever, as we may.
Callum continued, his voice only a little more gentle as he hung his head.
When her life is over, so is yours. You have condemned yourself, brother. You have signed your death warrant, and there's nothing I or any other can do about it.
With that, he dematerialized, returning to the mountain in his sleep-frozen body. His departure left an uneasy mist behind.
Tyler.
Walter wasn't sure if he should come any closer or go for more water like he'd contemplated getting earlier. Was his friend having some kind of spiritual experience? Or was it the obvious pain talking?
Tyler!
He asked again. He had not seen any other entity near his friend and couldn't help but wonder. The dragon clenched his teeth once more, his lips pressed firmly together. Closing his eyes in anguish, he gave voice to the chaos inside his heart. His scream didn't go far.
Anwen!
He choked, hitting the ground with one fist.
Why did Kern never tell me?
Images flashed behind his closed eyelids. Kern, the great Nurim, leader of the dragons. At one time he had a mate. She had been the mother of all other dragons, mother to all dragons of silver scales. The faint stirrings of memory shifted inside his mind. He had never actually met his mother. She had given birth to many, and her offspring had given life to many more. Tyler had been one of the last, before she had unexplainably died. At least that's what he'd thought, up until now. Quiet whispers now reminded him of how his mother had fallen in love with a mortal. Rumors spread of their love and how the Nurim had pronounced on them his blessing. He had given her freedom from their union, and then their mortal enemy had attacked the outlying settlement her love had tried to create. The man had died. His draconic wife died in tandem, falling from the sky as she raced to rescue him from harm. Perhaps she had been foolhardy, as Tyler had been, and given part of her soul to that mortal man. Kern had been upset for many years after her death, never taking another mate. Though he'd sanctioned the union with the mortal, she had been his favorite. Not even after his other children offered their own offspring did he take a mate. It wasn't until Anna Magus had come along that he loved another female. It was no wonder the pairing had been considered taboo. She was mortal, and all feared he might give her a portion of his soul, just as his previous love had to another mortal. Tyler opened his eyes, registering the night sky. Looking around, he realized Walter was there, staring at him. He'd likely tried to get his attention for some time.
Anwen,
He breathed, still feeling the acidic pain piercing through him.
we must return to the island and find her. I fear she's in trouble.
Walter took a step back. The dragon sounded almost desperate, but whether it was from pain or some other reason, he wasn't sure. He glanced up to the sky and noted the position of the moon. Morning was slowly creeping upon them. At least his friend hadn't made a full transformation, staying mortal size, though his skin was covered in scales.
Can you stand?
He finally asked. Gathering his willpower, Tyler tried. Walter had to help him. Even with his support, he felt weak and useless. His friend had to half carry him to the raft. Once inside the boat, he flopped next to the canisters and boxes.
Just a moment.
He said in response to Walter's questioning gaze. 5 minutes later, he had gathered what felt like his remaining strength, insisting he help paddle the raft across the water. It took just about all he had to not let out another cry of pain. If he felt this much, he reasoned, how much more must Anwen be feeling? And if these sensations were coming from her, what was causing them? At least he'd managed to halt his transformation. They didn't need the mage circle storming the lake as well.